From 1991 to 1998, the Chicago Bulls won 6 NBA championships. They were not only at that time the best basketball team in the world, but many believe the greatest basketball team in history. They were led by Michael Jordan, the GOAT. That stands for greatest of all time. Don't you dare bring up LeBron James in this conversation. No one who watched both of them play think that he was as good as Jordan. Now, those years, 1991 through 1998, were not just Michael Jordan's basketball prime. They happened to be mine as well. Coincidence? I don't know. But as I was playing basketball in high school and college, I was watching Jordan dominate at the highest level. Now, during that time, Jordan endorsed a number of companies, but the two most prominent were Nike and Gatorade. So Nike came out with the Air Jordans, very popular shoes then and now. Gatorade produced a commercial, a very famous commercial, some of you might remember it, showing Jordan playing basketball and then hydrating with their sports drinks. And it was all set to a song with these lyrics. Sometimes I dream that he is me. You've got to see that's how I dream to be. I dream I move. I dream I groove like Mike. If I could be like Mike. We all wanted to be like Mike, to move and groove like Mike. Now, I was playing basketball during that time, and there were some ways that I could be like Mike. When I got thirsty, I could drink Gatorade like Mike drank Gatorade. I could buy Jordans, and so I could wear Air Jordans like Mike wore Air Jordans. I could practice basketball for hours on end, just like Mike practiced basketball for hours on end. I could wear baggy shorts, a wristband halfway at my forearm. I could stick my tongue out, all like Mike did those things. But no matter how hard I tried, I could not be like Mike in every way. I was never able to master dribbling down the court, jumping from the free throw line, and dunking it like Mike did. I was not able to score 63 points in the playoffs against the Boston Celtics like Mike did. I didn't lead Team USA to an Olympic gold medal like Mike did. My ability to imitate Mike was limited. Like even this morning, I wore a pair of Air Jordans just to see what would happen. I've been very disappointed. I have not moved or grooved like Mike this morning. There's still time, though. As we continue to study the account of God creating the world, we come this morning to the creation of mankind. Last week we looked at the first 5.5 days of creation, and we realized that God made us to be like Him. We were created in His image, and this shapes everything we do and everything we are. It shapes how we view ourselves. It shapes how we view other people. It shapes our perspective on issues related to life and purpose, our understanding of morality and dignity. Being made like God is a gift, but it has its limits. We are like God, but we are not God. So on the 6th day of creation, we learn what it means that we are made to be like God, and on the 7th, we're reminded that we're not like God in every way, that certain things are still impossible for us. Now, the verses we cover this morning, they're foundational to our understanding of what it means to be human. These are key verses that really the Bible explores and builds on for the rest of it. So let's start by looking at day 6 of creation and learning ways we are like God. So if you remember, day 5, God created the first of the living creatures. So birds that fly, fish that swim. Day 6, He creates livestock and the creatures that dwell on the land. Now, one characteristic all living things have in common is the need for food. And this is mentioned in verses 29 and 30. God says, "Look, I have given you every seed-bearing plant on the surface of the entire earth, every tree whose fruit contains seed. This will be food for you." He goes on and he ends that, "I have given every green plant for food." So God creates living creatures, and then He creates this world that meets the needs of the living creatures by producing food that strengthens them, food that sustains them, that we, in this way, as humans, we're like the other living beings. We're not self-sustaining. We need something from outside of us in order to survive. We're like birds, fish, and livestock in this way. But we're unlike them in a very, very significant way. Only humans are made in God's image. Look again at verse 26. God says, "Let us make man in our image according to our likeness." Verse 27, "So God created man in His own image. He created him in the image of God. He created them male and female." Now, we learned earlier that the animals reproduce after their kind. So in verse 21, look, it says, "Fish and birds according to its kind." Now, verse 25, livestock and crawling things according to its kind. So when we come to humans, we expect the text to say according to its kind, but instead we find something else, something surprising, that mankind is actually created in God's image, according to his likeness, verse 26. This phrase, image of God, helps us properly understand who we are and why we exist. What does it mean that you and I are made in God's image? In what ways are we created to be like God? Well, here's the first of 4 ways. First, we represent. We represent. So an image is a visible representation of someone or something. So in religious practice, there would be images of God, and these images are called idols. So just think about this. We see this throughout the Bible, that people created images. These images are created of gold or wood or stone, metals, and that image is worshipped because it represents the God they think will bless them. So here's an example. When Jacob, the grandson of Abraham, he leaves his father-in-law's house, and he takes all of his family and his belongings with him, his wife Rachel, she steals, here's the phrase, chapter 31 of Genesis, his household gods, or his household idols, is what it says. He steals her father's household idols. While her father chases after them, and he catches up to him and he says this, "Why have you stolen my gods?" So in other words, in his mind, the idols represent his God to such a degree that to steal his idols is to steal his gods. Now, when God gives Israel the 10 commandments, the second of the 10 commandments says this in Exodus 20, "Do not make an idol for yourself, whether it's in the shape of anything in the heavens above, or on the earth below, or in the waters under the earth." So we should ask ourselves, why not? Why does God not want his people to create idols to represent him, like all of the other nations create these images to represent their gods? In fact, just a couple of chapters after God gives that command, Israel does exactly what he forbids. They make this image of a calf, and they set it up, and they worship it, but they were worshiping God through the image of a calf. And God reacts with anger. Why? They're worshiping him. They say, this is the God who brought us out of Egypt. So they're worshiping God. They're just doing it through this image. Why is that a problem? Well, the reason is because God has already created images to represent him. And because he's created these images in every man and woman around you. And so frogs and flies and cows and crows and sheep and sharks, they don't bear the image of God. Only men and women do. We're created to represent him, and to represent him in any other way, God says, demeans him and also diminishes his image in his people. Shakespeare wrote a play called As You Like It, and he opens with maybe one of the famous lines he's ever written. It begins this way: "All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players." Now, I'm not a Shakespeare expert. I don't know how he intended to mean it, but he's right in this sense. The world is a stage, and you and I are created to play the role of image bearers. We're to enter the stage and represent the writer, director, and producer. Our purpose for existing, this is what we find from the very beginning, is we're supposed to reveal the truth about our Creator, to show who he is, to show what he's like. And because we are made in God's image, we have dignity, and we have value, and we have worth above and beyond any other created beings. Now, if you have a pet, you might consider that pet part of your family. My family has 2 dogs, and we love one of them very much. There is something fundamentally distinct, though, between a poodle and a person. Someone may push their cat around in a stroller and call them their fur baby, right? But that does not bestow on the cat dignity that is bestowed on a person because they're made in the image of God. The image of God is why human life is more valuable than any other life on the planet. Now, this is made clear later in the book of Genesis, when God institutes capital punishment for taking a human life. And the reason given in Genesis 9 is because humans are made in God's image. James, the brother of Jesus, when he tells us why it's wrong to curse other people, says it's because we curse people who are made in God's likeness. So the image of God is what makes human life precious. It gives dignity to every single human being. Because we represent God, our lives have meaning, purpose, and worth. Now, this maybe you're saying, of course that's true. That just makes sense. But we got to understand this is at odds with how other worldviews and philosophies look at human life. Let me give you an example. The caste system in India, where they're assigned different values based upon the caste or the class into which they're born. That comes from Hinduism. So in Hindu teaching, the different castes all emerge from Brahma's body. And so the top caste, the Brahmins, they come out of his mouth. The next caste comes from his arms, so on down to his feet. And then there's a group of people who exist outside the caste system, the untouchables, and it's believed they don't come from Brahma at all. So just think about what the philosophy then in Hindu teaching is, that not all human life has value, and that your life has value that corresponds to the class in which you were born. Like, that's at odds with what we find here. Let me give you another example. A few years ago, I read an article which claimed that Iceland had almost completely eradicated Down syndrome. Of course, the way they eradicated it was through genetic screening and abortion. Listen to the article. It says this: the vast majority of women, close to 100%, who received a positive test for Down syndrome terminated their pregnancy. Do you understand the thinking behind that view of the world? In that worldview, human life does not have inherent dignity and value. Humans are valuable only as long as they're productive. So if you don't think a baby will be productive in whatever way you define productive, then you should just terminate it. That's the same thinking that drives euthanasia, eugenics, racism. It's what's led to genocide and slavery. Because if your view of the world is that not that humans have dignity and value, they're just evolved animals, then if someone's different than you can assign them less value, and then it's okay to treat them like cattle. What is it that makes a person value? What gives a person value? What makes a person valuable? Is it what they can do for us? Like how much money they can make. So if there's a lawsuit that's a wrongful death lawsuit, and they find that someone was responsible for a wrongful death, the amount of money given to the family who wins the case is based upon potential earning power. Is that what makes someone valuable? Is that the measure of their life? Well, as Christians, we understand that life is valuable because every single human being represents God. They are made in His image. They're designed to reveal something about who God is. And so we've got to be careful. Like we hear those examples and we say, oh, I reject those entirely. But we've got to be careful that we don't, in more subtle ways, diminish the value of human life. We need to ask ourselves, do I treat every person with the dignity that comes from bearing the image of God? So when you see a homeless person who's unwashed, maybe a little unstable, do you treat them with dignity? Or do you sort of ignore them, try to go the other way? What about someone who speaks a different language, who's here without proper documentation? How about the person with a physical or mental handicap? And so it's not only challenging, it's pretty awkward and uncomfortable to be around them. Or the elderly person who doesn't hear very well. They struggle to remember who you are, or what happened, or what you talked about. Every person you have ever met is made in God's image, is made in God's likeness. They are created to represent Him, and that gives them dignity and value. The Declaration of Independence begins by asserting the truth that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That's a good statement. It's true biblically. However, before the rights comes dignity. It comes value. All men, all women, all children are valuable, not for what they've done, not for their potential, or even their potential to earn, or for their strength, for their memory, for their beauty or health. Their value comes from their Creator, who designed them, who made them to represent Him. And so we are like God because we were made to represent him. Here's the second way we're like God. We rule. Look at verse 26. God made mankind to do what? To rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the livestock, the whole earth, the creatures that crawl on the earth. So he creates them, us, for that purpose. Then verse 28, he commands us to do what? Rule the fish, birds, and every creature. So created and commanded to rule. God, we've seen this in the first chapter, right? God is the sovereign ruler of the cosmos, and he instructs us to rule as his representatives on earth. We have the rule of stewardship. Right? He's the high king, not us. We're his representative. We're ruling on his behalf. Now notice what we're supposed to rule. Verse 26, fish, birds, livestock, creatures. It's also described in verse 28 as subduing the earth. Not subduing each other, but subduing the earth. So God makes this good world. He entrusts to us the responsibility of expanding his good rule from a little garden in the middle of the globe to every corner of every continent. The problem is that because of sin, we exploit instead of rule. We take what we want and we use it for what we think is our good, regardless of the good of others. We don't view ourselves as stewards, accountable to God for how we exercise our responsibility to rule his creation. This summer, Carrie and I stayed at the home of a pastor and his family who are on sabbatical. Through some connections, we were offered their home for a couple days. It happened to be near one of our sons, and we were able to stay there when we were visiting him. How do you think we treated their home? Do you think we trashed it? Do you think when they returned from their sabbatical, it looked like someone had broken in and ransacked it? Or do you think we treated it like our parents taught us to treat it? Leave it better than when you found it. Right? We understood that this home we stayed in for a couple days, it wasn't ours, but it was kindly entrusted to us for a period of time. Brothers and sisters, this world is not ours, it's God's. It's been entrusted to us. We're supposed to rule as his representatives, and we will be accountable to God for how we care and cultivate the good world he placed us in. Now, I think there are two mistakes that Christians often make when they think about our stewardship of God's world. One mistake is to see creation as everything, and one is to see creation as nothing. So when we see creation as everything, right, this is when we don't recognize the image of God and we think everything has as much value as human beings. That's a mistake. When we see it as nothing, right, we ignore the fact that God told us to steward it and to represent him in the way that we do it. So we should ask ourselves, up to this point, when God gives us this command, you're to rule as my representatives, how do we see God use his power? Right, we're told God has used it over and over. We're told he has used it for good. And what's that mean? It means to create, to order, to shape. That God rules in such a way that things flourish under his care. Is that how you rule? In the places where God has given you authority, are things flourishing? Do your employees, those who report to you, do they flourish under your leadership? Would they say that? This person, my boss, my supervisor, they really care about me. They invest in me. They want to see me do well. Is your home a place of creativity and order? Do you work to make your neighborhood fruitful for everyone who lives there? Or do you treat it like, well, this part belongs to me. I'll do with it what I want? Are you using your strength, the strength God gave you, to serve those in your church and community? When we think about ruling, we have to think about what Jesus said. He said in Matthew 20, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those in high positions act as tyrants over them. It must not be like that among you. On the contrary, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. Whoever wants to be first among you must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So we rule as God's representatives by serving others and putting their needs before our own for the good and flourishing of everything God has entrusted to us. Third way we're like God, we relate. We relate. The uniqueness of humanity is seen in the language God used in verse 26. He says, let us make man in our image according to our likeness. We talked about last week that God is triune, which means 3 in 1. And he uses plural terms in addressing himself. Let us make man in our image according to our likeness. So God, by his very nature, is relational. He relates to himself, and he makes us to relate to him, to relate to each other. And so we see this, even in the way that he creates humanity as male and female, this relational aspect of God's nature and ours in his likeness. Here's what it means very simply. We are created for community. And we represent God most fully in the way we relate to him and to the people around us. In fact, what did Jesus say? On the night before he's crucified, he gathers his disciples. He says, this is how people you know you belong to me. This is how they know you're my disciples, that you follow me. And what was the way? If you love one another. Like we represent him most fully, not in isolation, but in intimacy with each other. So when the Spirit of God is at work in the people of God, the evidence of that, or what's called the fruit of the Spirit in us is what? Love, joy, peace, patience, and these type of traits that are relational. So think about it this way. The way that you relate to other people is either a positive or a negative representation of your Creator. That certain ways of relating to people, when you relate to people in certain ways, you accurately represent God. And in other ways, you ignore, diminish, and even despise the likeness of God. So what do your relationships reveal to others about who God is? Do people get an accurate picture of God from the way that you treat them? Now, we can't ignore in this text that God made us as male and female, so part of his good creation is our gender. Remember we talked about last week that there are some who deny that God is creator. They suppress the truth that is evident. Well, we can see also that some deny that God made male and female, even though that truth is evident. So we should ask ourselves, why does this happen? Why does this happen that some people take something so evident and so obvious and they suppress that? Well, first, it's important that we understand we're not to chapter 3 yet and the fall, but we need to understand the devastating effects of the fall and how it's distorted everything, including our self-perception. And what that means then is that when people struggle with these issues of their gender, are they male and female, and identity and all of these things, that they're fighting a real battle in their hearts that's hard and painful because of sin, because of the brokenness of our world. Second, we got to understand that this fall has affected our bodies and that there are sometimes real physical issues that manifest in the body in abnormal ways. That sometimes people are born, we call it, with a birth defect. And the defect doesn't mean the design isn't good or the design isn't right. In fact, it reveals that the design is wise, but that sin has this devastating effect on us physically as well as spiritually. But third, and I think this is maybe most important of all, every single one of us needs to recognize that we struggle to acknowledge and submit our lives to God's good design. We all do this in different ways. And so one way people do this sometimes is they deny God's sovereign choice to make them male or female. This is one of the ways that they act out in rebellion, just like you and I act out in rebellion in different ways. And we need to help them see that joy never comes from continuing in rebellion. It comes when you submit yourself to God's authority. You believe that his commandments are good, and then you align yourself with his plan for you, even when it's really, really hard. But listen, no matter what struggles a person deals with, our responsibility is to treat them with dignity. Nothing they do removes the image of God in them. The way we treat them with dignity is ultimately we bring them back in a loving and gracious way to the wonderful truth that they were made to represent God by relating to him and relating to others in the way that he intended. So we relate. Fourth, finally, we reproduce. We reproduce. So in verse 28, God blesses humanity and says, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. So the blessing of God is connected to life and the ability he gives us to reproduce life. So just think about this. The blessing, when God blesses the first humans, it's not just for them. It's for everyone they will pass life on to. So to reproduce the image of God in our descendants is a privilege that only comes because God chose to bless us with the gift of life. So God finishes creating all this in verse 31. And he looks at it and he says, this world is very good indeed. So he has filled this world with living creatures and all the food that they need to survive. Then in the middle of it, he has placed his representatives and he's given them the authority to steward it. And he commands them to bear children who will slowly spread around the globe, using their strength to steward his creation so it becomes increasingly fruitful. And he steps back and he says, yes, this is good. We're told in Psalm 127:3 that children are a blessing from God. Let's not forget this. They are also loud, dirty, ornery, chaos makers. But they are a gift. And one of the common ways, one of the common schemes of the devil is to devalue children. So he's done it in some overt ways. These are easy to spot. We think about Egypt, when they ordered the murder of all of these male babies. Moses was spared from this. We think about when Herod did the same thing in Israel years later. We see it in our culture in the past century when millions of unborn have been slaughtered, in policies like there was in China for a long time, forbidding families to have more than one child. These are very overt ways that Satan devalues children. But there are more subtle ways. And we've got to be very cautious and careful that we spot these and see what's going on. Like how Satan encourages married couples to perpetually delay having children in order to advance their careers. Or sometimes when a family has a fourth or fifth child, a Christian will jokingly say something like, don't they know how that keeps happening? Like what may be meant as a joke could actually reveal ways that we have devalued the blessing of reproduction. Now, this blessing goes beyond physical descendants and includes spiritual ones. The Apostle Paul, as far as we know, didn't have any physical offspring, but he calls Timothy his son in the faith. He writes letters to churches and he says, you are my children. So he has spiritually reproduced himself as he leads others to saving faith in Jesus, and all of us share this responsibility. If you're single and you mourn the fact that God has not given you the opportunity to have children of your own, understand that you still have the God-given calling to reproduce yourself in others as you work to fill the earth with those who bear the image of Jesus Christ. So how are you working to be fruitful and multiply as a disciple of Jesus? Are you reproducing yourself through disciples? Are you sharing the gospel and seeing God produce fruit? Now, these terms, blessing and offspring, ultimately point us ahead to Jesus. The offspring of the woman who reverses the curse of sin, who restores in us the image of God, and he leads us to eternal blessings. So our hope is not found in our ability to bear the image of God, but in Jesus, who is the image of the invisible God. Colossians 1 says, for God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him, Jesus, to reconcile everything to himself, whether things on earth or things in heaven, making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Through Jesus, what was deformed by sin is restored by faith. Now, I wonder if as we've talked about this privilege we've been given to be like God, and maybe you've realized how little you are like him, how you don't represent him very well. Maybe like me, you often misuse your position and authority to get your own way. Or maybe your relationships are marked by selfishness instead of service, by pride instead of humility. Maybe you haven't invested your life in reproducing disciples. Maybe you look in the mirror and you think, man, I don't look very much like God. Guess what? None of us do. And that's why Jesus came. He died in our place, bearing our sins so that we could be forgiven, reconciled to God, and we could start this process of being conformed to his image. Our only hope to fulfill the purpose for which we were created is through Jesus. So in creation, God made us like him, designed to represent him in the way we rule over creation as stewards, relate to him and each other, and reproduce ourselves in physical and spiritual offspring. So If day 6 shows us ways we are like God, then day 7 shows us ways we are not like God. Look at verse 1 of chapter 2. So the heavens and the earth and everything in them were completed. On the 7th day, God had completed his work that he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work that he had done. God blessed the 7th day and declared it holy, for on it he rested from all his work of creation. Here's the first way. We need rest. God does not. We need rest. God does not. God rests on the 7th day. Why does God rest? Well, it's not because he's tired. The prophet Isaiah assures us that God, Isaiah 40, verse 28, never becomes faint or weary. So God doesn't establish this pattern of rest because he needs it. He establishes it because we need it. God's kindness to us is the reason behind this pattern. So later in that same chapter where Isaiah says God never grows weary, he says this, even youths become faint and weary, and young men stumble and fall. So even the most fit among you, the ones who have the most energy, they still get tired. So we weaken and grow weary, God doesn't, and so because he loves us and he knows our weakness, he establishes this pattern of rest. We need rest. And this is not just a physical rest, it's more than that, it's a spiritual rest. What does Jesus say? Jesus invites all those who are weary and burdened to come to him to receive rest for their souls. So we exist in these cycles of sin and shame that wear us down and wring us out. And when we don't know what else to do, we remember that the one who never grows tired invites us to come to him, hitch ourselves to his yoke, where we will find strength to endure. Now, all of us long for rest. And all of us seek rest. And if we're honest, all of us find it elusive. Like we hope it will come, sometimes in that new job. There's been a lot of tension, a lot of difficulty, a lot of anxiety in my last job, this new job. This is what I'm looking for. Or that vacation. It's been on the calendar for a long time. We've just barely made it. We're running on fumes. This vacation is going to provide the rest I need. If I get paid better, I get a raise, I get a bonus. Now I don't have to worry and be anxious about paying the bills. We've got enough. This will provide rest. A new house. All of these things. And we find out as soon as we get them what? It doesn't work. They don't provide the rest we think they need. And here's why. We were made to rest in God. But sin puts us on a treadmill with no way to get off. Excuse me. Like the Israelites wandering through the wilderness, we live in this sort of perpetual fear of the enemies outside of us and the sin inside of us. So where can we find rest? Well, in the example of the Israelites, they were just waiting for this promised land. And they thought, when we get to this promised land, then we'll have rest. But the problem is they brought their own sin into the promised land. The promised land was simply a picture of God's rest that comes only through Jesus Christ. Here's what the writer of Hebrews says in Hebrews 4, verse 9. He says, therefore, a Sabbath rest remains for God's people. For the person who has entered his rest has rested from his own works, just as God did from his. Exactly. See, the only way, that's what it's saying, Hebrews 4, the only way for us to enter God's rest is to stop trying to make it on our own and instead turn to Jesus. We need rest. And so God, from the very beginning, he designs a way for us to rest from our labors, but a way that pushes us ultimately to Jesus. Here's the second way we're not like God. We need faith. God does not. We only find rest by trusting God. So this is far removed from us, so we have to think about what life would be like under these commands. To obey the Sabbath commands meant that no matter what, there's one day a week where you ceased from your labor. And 1 year every 7 years, you didn't plant. You only do that if you trust God to take care of you. The Sabbath reminds us that we are completely dependent on God. Verse 3, God declares the day of rest holy. Holy means separate. And so the rest comes, here's why. The rest comes because this day is offered to God, set apart from all other days as for God's purposes. It's a way of saying, God, I trust you enough to just give you this day. So you only learn to rest as you learn to turn from your self-reliance and put your faith in the goodness of God. So going back to Hebrews 4, how does someone enter God's rest? Here's what the writer of Hebrews says, "For we who have believed enter the rest." So in the Ten Commandments, God institutes the practice of Sabbath, where Israel is forbidden from working, but the Sabbath was never about keeping rules. It was about trusting God enough to stop working. It was learning to live as a creature in dependence on our Creator. Practicing the Sabbath marked a person as a follower of God because their faith was in God to provide for their needs, even if they stopped working. Now, we are no longer obligated to avoid one work one day of the week. Colossians 2 tells us that. Because the point of the Sabbath was to lead us to Jesus, to faith in Jesus, the only one who could actually provide the rest our souls long for. The rule is no longer in effect, but the point of the rule remains. Do you labor as if everything depends on you? When you look at your life and you look at your future, do you act as if your security and well-being is entirely dependent on your effort? Would someone watching you recognize that you trust your welfare to God? Is your faith in God as evident in the way you live as it would have been when the Sabbath regulations were in effect? Years ago, I was in the airport with Jack, my oldest son. We were waiting for our flight to take off when this older lady approached us and said, "Your son looks just like you." I thanked her, and she walked away, and I was puzzled because I've never thought he looked like me. Jack is tall and lanky. 2 words never used to describe me. His hair's blonde. His eyes are blue like his mom's, not like mine. So I was surprised by her comment. Then I thought about what we were doing when she made the comment. So we were sitting in the airport waiting for our flight, and we were both reading. So we were doing the same activity. I think because we were sort of sitting in the same type of uncomfortable airport chairs reading that we both sort of adopted the same posture. And then I think when we both read and we're concentrating, we both open our mouths just a little bit. So the same mannerisms. So he didn't look like me physically, but he looked like me because of what he was doing and how he was doing it. So brothers and sisters, we were made to look like our Father, but our Father is invisible. He is spirit. And since that is true, the likeness we share with him is not physical. We look like him when we do what he does, and we do it in the way he does it. You were made to represent God in everything you do. This should be the purpose of your life, the North Star that guides you, the motivation to get you moving each day, is it? Through the work of Christ and the power of the Spirit at work in you, are you looking more and more like your Father? Let's pray.